Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the second session of the National Commission to Address Racism in Nursing's third ECHO series. This series will have a focus on health equity. Whether you have been involved in previous ECHO sessions or are new to this space, we are so excited to be back and hope this interactive learning series is a place for you to find guidance and support. This program is brought to you by the National Commission to Address Racism in Nursing, a multi-organizational collaborative of leading nursing organizations examining the issue of racism within nursing and motivating all nurses to confront systemic racism. This is an 8-part series. You will earn 1.5 continuing nursing education units for attending today's session. Please stay to the end to complete your evaluation and receive the CNE certificate. Today's topic is how do healthcare's concealed weapons of harm drive inequity? This is a brave and safe space. Discussing racism and health equity is difficult and uncomfortable, especially for those directly impacted. Discussions such as these can serve as a trigger. We ask that you maintain respect for everyone joining us today. Please also stay on mute until it is your turn to speak. Listen intently and respond thoughtfully. Please be present, so limit background distractions, and if you can, avoid multitasking. Please take advantage of the virtual features available via Zoom. We encourage turning your cameras on and using the chat box or the raise your hand features to communicate with the group, but please remember to mute your microphone when others are speaking. We also really want to be mindful and respect participant privacy, so please do not disclose names or other sensitive information that is being shared today. If you share a scenario involving a patient, please do not provide any PHI during today's call or any of the ECHO sessions. Feel free to send a direct message to ANA ECHO if you have technical problems during today's call. I am now going to turn this presentation over to our presenter today, Dr. Katie Boston-Leary.
Thank you, Kara. Hello, everyone. I'm really excited to be with you all this evening. I'm going to load my slides. So give me a second here. Afternoon for some of you, morning for others. All right, hopefully you can see my slide deck. That's new. I haven't seen a delay like that happen before. Let me try again. Let me stop share. Screen. How about I do this one? All right, can you see it now?
Yeah, that's perfect.
All right, thank you. Sorry about that. So I plan on pulling the thread a little bit more on what you heard in the first ECHO series session from Dr. Ramey Alexander, where she talked about having an equity mindset. And the key piece of what she shared, which was a phenomenal presentation. I've heard it twice over the last month or so. I've had the privilege, but I plan to pull the thread a little bit on what she mentioned in terms of identifying unchecked harm and perpetuation of inequities. We have to recognize that this exists not just with the care that we deliver, but also it exists amongst each other, and how we understand it, identify it, and address it, because that's kind of a bit of our dirty little secret in nursing. Let me make sure my slides are moving. So in terms of my objectives, I plan on verbalizing The audience, you will verbalize understanding of this concept of civilized oppression. Hopefully some of you have heard of this before, and it's not your first time. And if not, it's okay. If you haven't heard about it, we're going to talk about it, and how it impacts the nursing profession and care delivery. We're also going to talk about incivility behaviors that are rooted in racism and other isms that we tend to see, because we know that discrimination happens in a number of different spaces. It's not just about race. Recognize differences between being privileged and oppressed, and how we can leverage. We all can fall in either category at any point, depending on where we are, and how we can leverage our privilege, depending on the rooms that we're in, for a more inclusive future. And then I'm going to share a model that I developed to help with understanding how a very familiar model to all of us as clinicians and as nurses, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, can be utilized to help us better set up these DEI concepts that are constantly moving and evolving for a number of us. So, the key thing about today is, we're going to try to get at the roots of why we are where we are, why we're dealing with what we're dealing with. The late Desmond Tutu had a saying about how we need to stop pulling people out of the river and go to the top to find out why they're falling in the first place. So we are going to go into the roots of why we are where we are and what we need to do to get out of this place that we are, where we're still dealing with the isms, particularly as it relates to race. I also want to set up a trigger warning, because some of this content may be hard to hear and maybe challenging, and it may trigger some emotions in you. So I just want to put that in the room, that even though some of this may be hard, that's what we have to do. And sometimes the unfiltered truth is what gets us on the other side. And if you need support, of course, lean on a friend for support and reach out, because that's what we're supposed to do for us to help deal with these issues. So as I mentioned, we're going to get to the roots of where we are, but the weeds is what we tend to see. The roots is what's planted on the ground that keeps us here. And a lot of it shows up in the form of harm that's non-physical. And some will coin it in the terms using civilized oppression as concealed weapons. For a number of us in clinical settings, we've heard about RCAs and root cause analysis. Whenever there's an adverse event, that's what we do. We try to get to the bottom of it. We try to understand why an error happened where a patient almost lost a life or a limb. So this is really a way for us to use that methodology to get us to understanding why we continue to be where we are. And that's how we get to the contributing factors, the underlying issues. We do some drilling down. We hopefully will root out and dig into what keeps us in this place. A quote from Melissa Jones from AACN Colleges of Nursing. There was an article, critical care, excuse me. There was an article about physical violence, about workplace violence. And I love this quote of hers about how she says, the problem of physical violence against healthcare workers is a weed with deep roots that keeps growing. NIOSH, in terms of workplace violence, because that's really how it also shows up, right, is really about how they define workplace violence as the act or threat of violence, ranging from verbal abuse to physical assaults directed towards persons at work or on duty. I did an article with ARN where I wanted to talk about some of the subtle forms of assaults that we tend to gloss over and not pay attention to, but they really do hurt people. I know Dr. Alexander talks a lot about how, the term microaggressions should possibly be a thing of the past, because what you may see as a microaggression may have a macro impact on the receiver. So is it really microaggressions? And does that minimize what people may be experiencing, even though on the sender's end, it was just a little word and a little slip of the tongue, but it's something that could stay with someone for years, for their entire lifetime, because of how they felt when they heard what they heard. So this is a quote of an article that I did for ARN. Subtle forms of assault, such as through words, are considered concealed weapons because the words harmed you and you didn't see them coming. But the abuse can also create a shock and awe response that leaves you wondering if you really heard what you heard. And you might second guess yourself or wonder if anyone will believe you. So let's talk a little bit more about the weeds. This is a quote from Charlotte Bronte about how, with prejudices, which is well known, They're more difficult to eradicate from the heart, whose soil has never been loosened or fertilized by education. They grow firm there, firm as weeds among stones. Talked about workplace violence, and NIOSH has 4 different categories of workplace violence, but the one that we're going to focus on, which is what I mentioned earlier, is worker on worker. Now, we're still going to talk about the impact on patients, but the old saying about how charity begins at home, we need to start thinking about how we treat each other and how that translates to how we treat patients and families. The weeds tend to show up in a number of different ways, which you see here: general incivility, where you see between peers, lateral violence, by bullying, nurses eating their young, mentors becoming mentors. That's also from Dr. Alexander. Thank you for that. Also saw that on Ted Lasso, by the way. So it's becoming pretty popular. Maybe you're saying got into Hollywood. Verbal abuse and harassment, and then you have racism and discrimination, and then the othering that tends to happen in nursing, where there are pay differences, we saw that during the pandemic with new nurses coming in, earning more than their incumbents that are training them, and that created some not so positive behaviors between groups. Specialty conflicts, we know sometimes there's drama, and I experienced this as a chief nursing officer between med-surg and ICU nurses, or the heart team versus a regular team in the OR, where there are assumed differences because of skill set and complexity, and how that sets up these conflicts as well. And then generational. We have about 5 or 6 generations now, typically in organizations, and how sometimes there are generational conflicts that we have to contend with as well. Now, in terms of the roots, it's important for us to understand the fragile social fabric of relationships between actors in terms of interactions and interfaces that must be explored. And exploring that allows us to better understand power differences, power dynamics, and chasms between people and all the actors within healthcare. And this is a great article that I had from Barisa that really explored these power differences and how that impacts how we relate to one another. If there's anyone here that has a surgical background, and I'm a very proud OR nurse. I'm not in a clinical setting anymore, but I hope to do that one day still, because it's a love of mine. This is a Sims retractor that's used in gynecological surgeries, and we use it for years, and we still do in the surgical arena. But when you dig into the history about how this instrument was developed, I'm sure this image just brings to mind the history about how Black women were experimented on by Marion Sims without anesthesia, and were held down by other slaves and he was considered for years to be the father of gynecology. His statue, I believe, recently was taken down with that statue movement that happened a couple of years ago. But these are the hidden truths that we need to contend with that keeps us here. There's also a belief that the thicker the skin and the darker it is, the less pain you feel. We know that there is a belief that still occurs in that space when you think about kidney disease patients and sickle cell patients and how they're treated when they show up in emergency rooms. I'm currently doing a study with B. Braun to understand how this also impacts IV starts in people of color, and whether this still plays into how many tries someone will get to start IVs in people of color versus non. So these are all things that we need to continue to explore as well. If you have not read this book yet or bought it, I highly, highly encourage you do. The political determinants of health is really disruptive, revealing look at healthcare and our systems and how they're set up, where we do have the haves and have-nots. And there are categories of have-nots that we need to contend with as well. The story with the allegory of the orchard, and I'd love to see in the chat whether you're familiar with this book and this theory that I think brings it all home, is how this farmer who had the option with the seeds that he had to plant seeds in rocky soil, poor soil, and one with rich soil. The farmer did plant these seeds in those three different types of soil. And naturally, the one that bore the most fruit was the one that was in fertile soil. But because the fruit was being producing in the tree that had fertile soil, that's what got all the attention. And even though the other 2 seeds produced something, the rocky soil and the not so fertile soil eventually had issues where they were not able to bear fruit. And there was one in terms of the rocky soil where they did not bear as much fruit as the tree that was planted in fertile soil. But with the little fruit that was being born in the rocky soil area, someone came in to do some studies on that tree and planted a fungus on that tree to further understand how is this tree that's barely not in good soil still bearing some kind of fruit. Let's study that and understand it better. So we apply that knowledge to even have more trees bear more fruit in fertile soil, and left that tree in a place because of the plant fungus that was planted on it in a place where it actually eventually died, even though it actually was resilient and bore some fruit in not so good soil. So when you think about that example, it just shows about how we tend to look at things in healthcare. We use terms like high utilizer, non-compliance with patients. And we have to understand that sometimes our patients and the people that we serve are where they are, not necessarily because they want to be there, but it's really about the circumstances that they find themselves in. And to a certain degree, with our curiosity and our interest to learn more with research, we go into those communities, learn all that we can about them, but still leave those communities where they were in the first place, or leave them in worse conditions without doing what we need to do to get them to a better place so they are in a fertile soil planted space. So highly encourage you read that book if you haven't read it yet, because it enlightened me. The other thing that I like to mention, and I am 45 minutes outside of Philadelphia, so I pay attention to the news there. My daughter is going to school there as well. We tend to believe that you have the Sun Belt state where you have patients in the South, the people in the South that tend to have not so good outcomes because of where they live. And we assume that in more democratic, bluer states politically, people are doing well because there's evenness, there's diversity and all that, but not necessarily so. And what this article shared is that, you know, even though there's diversity in Philadelphia, there's still separation in terms of health and health outcomes. And what's interesting when you look at this map, you will see the life expectancy rate for people that live at the Liberty Bell, where there's high socioeconomic status, is a lot higher compared to the community and the zip code where the hospital is. So we have to really understand that this is everywhere. It's not in the places that we assume because of their politics and some of the other things that we tend to look at in terms of diversity. We still have health inequities everywhere we look, and sometimes even under our doorsteps in the institutions that we work in. So our role, and with what we're trying to do here, and what we're trying to do with this work with the commission, is to let the people see. I know a number of you know this image of Emmett Till's mother in 1955, where he was killed, when he was killed. And when his body was returned to his mother and they were going to have the funeral, they were going to have a closed casket. And she insisted that this has to be an open casket because we have to let the people see. We have to let the people see what they did to my baby. And to a certain degree, with what we are contending with in healthcare, what we see as nurses, we have to expose those ugly truths as well. We have to let the people see. That's how we get attention. That's how she was able to get attention to what happened to her son, where that story remains something that we learn from today. Same thing applies with where we are today as clinicians and as nurses. This is an image from the march during after George Floyd was murdered, during the Black Lives Matter marches, where a nurse had this sign about, you know, what color am I when I save your life? And I know we tend to look at the sign in the front, but I like you to turn your eyes to the side where there was a white person that held a sign that said, use your privilege. There's no shame in having privilege. The shame is when we don't leverage it for the good of others and try to make sure that we set up an environment where everyone has a voice and everyone can feel heard and seen. further dig into that, there are elements of privilege compared to oppression that we need to be mindful of. Privilege is invisible to people with privilege. It defines what is normal. We see that in policies in healthcare. People are then also seen as individuals where they can have a voice. It's also bestowed unconsciously and automatically. Power and access to institutional and economic resources are there. And violence tends to be used to maintain power and privilege. For the oppressed group, we see that people are invisible and they feel dehumanized. They are othered. There's stereotyping that replaces individual preference and experiences. Individuals are made to represent the entire group, that tax that we tend to carry. They're blamed for their condition. There's limited access to power, and also they're subjected to violence and threats of violence to maintain oppression. So this is where we really talk about how civilized oppression is really about those concealed weapons that we tend to not talk about. Paulo Freire, I'm sure you're probably familiar with him. He's a godfather and the author of The Pedagogy of the Oppressed, where it's really about how, with his writings, the oppressed tends to strive for, instead of striving for liberation, they tend to themselves become oppressors. And why is that? It's really because liberation is like childbirth. It's long, it's painful, it's hard. It's hard to see the other end. And the easier, most available option to the oppressed is to want to, at any cost, to resemble their oppressors. It's also cyclical, where we see how there's power at the center and control in economics, right? My grandmother used to say, when things don't make sense, follow the money. And it starts with understanding that there's a place where there's justification. This is where it shows up systemically. There's a justification piece. And then you start to see it show up in institutional policies where there's this perpetuation and enforcement of those policies. There's this internalized dominance where the unwritten rules of who's in charge around here. It's not coming by title, but who are the superior beings, how that's set up unconsciously for these different groups. And then there's internalized oppression also about how you feel, about how you connect and how you're seen with other groups. And then society tends to buy into that overall. And we see that somewhat with the image of nursing, because nursing is mostly female. So there's an approval piece and there's legitimizing of it and normalizing of it. And then there's misinformation to keep it in place. No, not necessarily any evidence or data that proves it or indicates that this is the way it's supposed to be, but the misinformation is there that says that it has to be this way. And that's how we set up these systemic systems where there's marginalization, there's submissiveness, there's apathy with these target groups, where they really don't have the voice that they think they have or that we want them to have. Jay Harvey came up with the framework about civilized oppression, and I'm going to go over that briefly. It's about the subtle and normalized weapons of incivility that's wielded by the powerful over the powerless or less empowered, that's set up by the hierarchical systems. There are behaviors that are ingrained and unchallenged, unquestioned, and normative. These behaviors are also present in institutional assumptions. Those are the unwritten rules that I mentioned earlier, and they're not easily identified or recognizable or visible to the agent or the victim. With civilized oppression, the oppressor sometimes does not realize that they're oppressive, since the oppressor generally follows systemic rules and behaviors, and the oppressor not necessarily addressing these behaviors, since the behaviors go unchecked and they're rationalized. And then there's a key dynamic factor within interactions or systems of oppression, which is about that power piece and inequity. And it's really particularly with the diversity of peer and non-peer relationships. The socially accepted privileged group and a socially accepted less powerful group that sets up these differences that we have to see as well. So then we ask, why do nurses continue to harm each other? And why are they being harmed? And part of that has to do with the fact that there is a power dynamic issue in nursing. And this is an article that I invite you to read that was authored by Susan Roberts. It's going to be in the resources that you'll be provided so you can see that, not necessarily based on race, but it's based on the fact that we are a female-dominated profession. And when you look at healthcare in general, you see the data that indicates who's really running healthcare. It's not female and it's not BIPOC. I also did a dissertation on this in 2019, where I was able to uncover with my qualitative study that what happens in nursing is this feeling of loss of power. There's a lot of non-physical violence. There's systemic normalization and acceptance of negative behaviors. There's this cyclical role switching between the abused and being an abuser. And there's generalized apathy and fear. In other words, hurt people hurt people. Dr. Roberts also talks about the power ingredient and how it sets up the ability for oppression to thrive in environments. And fear and powerlessness are needed drivers for aggression and anger, which are the hallmark experiences for oppressive work environments. This is a visual that I found that really helps understand the social construct that we're all in, not only in the professional setting, but also in our personal lives. So if you think about the drivers and the trends and how, what set this up and what got us here, it's a colonialism piece, patriarchy, right? In terms of, again, when you look at healthcare, who's at the top versus who is at the bottom? The supremacy from one race compared to the other, superiority and dominance. And then it shows up in the world in all the isms. And outside of that, racism, sexism, homophobia, privilege, you see the rest of these. There's a lot more that we can add. And it's really all about those power dynamics piece that I talked about earlier. So how do we shift out of this? Because we can't just keep talking about the problem and how it shows up. We want to talk about how we get to the other side, the shiny tower on the hill. So for the future that we all want, regardless of who you are, where you're from, where you were born, the environment that you're in, what we should all want is a world that values diversity, where we could all hold multiple views without fear. There's fairness, there's a just culture, there's equity, there's a feeling of belonging. That's what we all want. And that's what we should all be striving towards with this an unrelenting desire to continue to hold on to the fact that we can create a new future, not just for ourselves, but for those that come after us. This is a visual that I created with Maslow's, and I have an article that hopefully will be coming out this fall, co-authored by Dr. Alexander and Dr. Stephen Davis. I'll make sure that we get it to you once it's published. But this helps set up how Maslow's hierarchy of needs can help us understand how we set up these different concepts for DEI that we tend to struggle with. You see the data indicates that nurses say that as much as there's been a lot of effort in this space for DEI, they don't feel that there's much of a difference. So we start at the bottom, right? Food, water, shelter. And that's where we feel that equality is where everything starts. And equality is what gets us to this place where we're driving and getting to a basic need for every human being. On top of that, we get to diversity and equity, where then people start feeling safe. They feel secure, they're stable, they have a sense of being seen and heard. And then on top of that, once you have diversity, equity, and equality, you can then get to the space of there being belonging, where people feel loved, they feel accepted, they are building relationships. And then on top of that, once there's belonging, there can be mattering. The definition of mattering is adding value and knowing that you're adding value. And that's where self-esteem is being built. That confidence, that mutual respect between people, no matter who you're interacting with. And once you get to all that at the pinnacle, right, which is what we all strive to be, again, top of the hill, human flourishing, where we're all reaching our potential. And this is important for everyone to see, because when we talk about equality and we talk about equity and all the things that we want to do and try to level the playing field, you hear people say, when you're looking at certain groups, you're taking from another. And what we're trying to reset here is the thinking that, no, it actually is a way for us to get to everyone reaching their potential, where it's not robbing from another source to make another one better. We all deserve to be able to get to human flourishing. This is a quote from Kareem Abdul-Jabbar that really I connected with. And he says, racism in America is like dust in the air. It seems invisible, even if you're choking on it, until you let the sun in. As long as we keep shining that light, we have a chance of cleaning it wherever it lands. I'm now going to share a video with you. Some of you have probably already seen this, but I'm sure you know this face. This is Trevor Noah. And someone from his audience, when he was on The Daily Show, asked him what the difference is between racism in America compared to racism in South Africa, i.e. apartheid. So give me a second to set this up. I'm going to stop sharing and go to the video. Share sound. Let's do this again.
Do you have any questions or anything before we move on? Anything you want to chat about? Anything on your mind? It's a fun part of a live show. Yes?
What's the difference between racism in South Africa and racism in America?
Oh, I love that. I love how you asked such a deep question in such a bubbly way. Because your tone of voice was really fun. So what's the difference between... Because there I thought you were going to say like, oh, the difference between like summer and spring for you. You're like, what's the difference between racism in South Africa and racism in the USA? Almost like my favorite topic. I will tell you what, I think the biggest difference between racism in America and racism in South Africa is I find that South African racism is and was a lot more blatant. And so there's more of an acknowledgement of it as an idea. And I always say to people, I know it's strange to say this, but I often think that was the greatest gift the apartheid government gave us, is that it was like, it was there, it was happening to you, it wasn't hidden. Do you know what I mean? So you were just like, we don't want this. People would fight, stop this apartheid, it's racism. And then the government would be like, yes, of course it is racism. That's what we're doing to you. The blacks must not do this. But then what happened in America is, you know, you hit that period where like they started changing things. I don't know if it was around Nixon, and they were like, oh, we've got to be silent about this. And then it wasn't blatant anymore. And so I always thought that's a terrible thing to do to people, because now people have to be like detectives of their own racism. They have to figure it out. You know what I mean? So let me give you an example. In South Africa, the government would just say, blacks cannot live in these areas. You're black, you don't live here. Now you know I'm black, I don't live here. I don't like it, but I don't live here. You get what I'm saying? But then in America, you'd be like, can I get a home loan? And they'd be like, no. And you'd be like, why? And they'd be like, no. They'd be like, why can't I? And then you just start realizing, you're like, wow, how come the black people all seem to only be able to get houses in these areas, but not in these areas? And these school districts are better. How come the money is going here? How come? And you get what I'm saying? And I know it sounds strange to say, but I think there's something liberating about fighting an obvious enemy as opposed to one that you have to prove exists. That's probably the biggest difference between America and, yeah. Say, what is your name? Katrina, you should.
All right. So I'm going to go back to my slide deck, and then I'm going to close. Lightning and disturbing too. So I talk about how there's the overt piece, but then there's a covert piece, the stuff that's subtle, the cuts that we tend to see, the way it lives under the surface, where it shows up and it's rationalized. These are all examples of kind of like that iceberg visual, where it's under the surface, and some of what's under the surface allows for a lot of these behaviors to continue because they're explained. So that's what we need to pay attention to. You get these slides, so you'll be able to look at all this afterwards. But the key thing that we're all trying to get to is really understanding the difference and the need for freedom and equal distribution of power. Freedom is being able to make decisions that affect mainly you, and power is being able to make decisions that affect you and the others around you. And we cannot confuse the two. And I'll close with this quote from Alice Walker. The most common way people give up their power is by thinking that they don't have any. We know that happens a lot in nursing. That happens a lot in the communities and with the people that we serve. And it's time for us to understand that we do have power and leverage that power for us to get to a better future. So with that, I'll stop sharing and I'll to I'm hearing some noises, but I'll go to the case study review and then we're going to go into breakout groups. So this case study that you're going to be discussing is really about how we're looking for how organizations manage these issues that we talked about in terms of the subtle aspects of oppression and racism and what tends to happen in the places that we work. Highly reputable institution just redid their values to include valuing diversity. The CNO, who's white, successfully recruited several international nurses from overseas. During her meeting with these nurses, they revealed fearfully their concerns about the harmful treatment of patients of color. Some shared their own experiences with racism and discrimination. Their families also having some issues living in the community as well. The CNO stated that, wow, I've never seen this in my 25 years in the organization, and we have numerous nurses here with similar backgrounds as you, which suggested these nurses were dealing with a culture shock and needed to allow more time to build relationships and adjust to the culture. So she shared those concerns with HR, but the VP of HR stated that they have not seen any evidence of these concerns. No one's reported them. And just told the CNO, encourage these nurses to report those issues to HR for proper follow-up. So 3 questions we'd like you to discuss. How can the CNO be a better ally to better advocate for these nurses? Is there anything the CNO could have done prior to these nurses' arrival to mitigate these issues? And third, what advice would you provide these nurses and what recourse do they have? So with that, I'll turn it over to my colleagues to get us in breakout groups. And for those of you that might drop off, thank you for listening. And hopefully you'll be able to stay on longer so we can talk about it in the main room.